The smoke stung Violet's eyes as she frantically dug through the still warm ashes that had once been her home, desperate to salvage anything that might remain of her former life. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory's unforgiving spring had brought not renewal but devastation to the young widow's doorstep. "Madam," a deep voice called from behind her. "There ain't much left to find in there." Violet didn't turn around. Her ash-blackened fingers continued to sift through the debris, occasionally burning on embers that still glowed beneath the surface. Tears cut clean tracks down her soot-covered face as she searched for any remnant of the life she had built with her husband before the fever had taken him 3 months prior. "Madam," the voice came again, closer this time. "You're going to hurt yourself." "I have nothing left to lose," she responded, her voice hollow. "My husband's pocket watch, his mother's Bible, our marriage certificate, something, anything." Her voice broke as she continued digging. The crunch of boots on charred made her finally look up. A tall man stood over her, his face shadowed by a worn leather hat. Sunlight caught on his badge, a deputy's star. He knelt beside her, seemingly unconcerned about the ash that would soil his denims. "Name's Blake Holloway," he said simply. "Deputy of Silver Creek. Rode out when I saw the smoke. I'm sorry I didn't get here in time to save your home." Violet stared at him, taking in his weathered face, strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that reminded her of the wide Montana sky. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, perhaps 10 years her senior. "Violet," she replied, her voice hoarse from smoke and crying. "Violet Porter." Deputy Holloway extended a gloved hand toward her. "Miss Porter, I can't bring back what you've lost, but I can offer you a safe place to stay in town while you figure things out." She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Her husband Thomas had been gone only 3 months. The homestead they'd struggled to build together for 2 years had burned to the ground while she was in town getting supplies. Now a stranger was offering help she had no choice but to accept. "Mrs.," she corrected softly. "Mrs. Porter." Then, with a deep breath, she placed her blackened hand in his. Blake didn't flinch at the soot that transferred to his glove. Instead, he helped her to her feet with a gentle strength that nearly broke what remained of her composure. "My horse is tethered over yonder," he said, gesturing to a handsome chestnut gelding. "We can come back tomorrow with a wagon to see what might be salvaged. Right now, you need food, clean water, and rest." Violet cast one last glance at the smoking ruins. "I should stay. There might be looters." Blake's expression softened. "Mrs. Porter, I don't mean to be unkind, but there's nothing left here worth stealing." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, and his hand moved to steady her elbow. "My husband and I worked this land for 2 years, she whispered. 2 years of backbreaking work, and now you start again," Blake said firmly. "This territory doesn't make anything easy, but it does reward those who refuse to surrender." Something in his tone, not pity, but respect, gave Violet the strength to nod. She allowed him to lead her to his horse, where he lifted her into the saddle with surprising ease before mounting behind her. As they rode away from the smoldering remnants of her past, Violet Porter closed her eyes against the sting of tears. She had no idea what awaited her in Silver Creek, but she knew with absolute certainty that life as she had known it was over. The town of Silver Creek came into view as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountain range to the west. Violet had been there only occasionally, mostly to sell eggs and butter or to pick up supplies they couldn't produce themselves on the homestead. Now she studied it with new eyes, the eyes of someone who might need to call it home. A single dusty main street ran through the center of town, lined with false-fronted wooden buildings. There was Simmons' General Store, the Silver Creek Saloon, a small church, the sheriff's office, and various other establishments necessary for frontier life. People moved about their business, paying little mind to the deputy riding in with a soot-covered woman. Blake guided his horse to a modest 2-story building with a sign reading Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house. "The widow Abernathy runs the cleanest establishment in town," Blake explained as he dismounted and helped Violet down. "She's strict, but fair." Violet suddenly became acutely aware of her appearance, hair wild and singed at the edges, dress torn and blackened with ash, face streaked with tears and soot. "I can't go in looking like this," she protested. Mrs. Abernathy has seen worse, Blake assured her. And she's got a soft spot for those who've faced hardship. The door opened before they reached it, revealing a plump woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Deputy Holloway, she acknowledged, her sharp eyes taking in Violet's condition. I heard about the fire at the Porter place. This must be Mrs. Porter. Violet was stunned. How did you know? News travels fast, even out here, Mrs. Abernathy replied. Besides, your husband came through town often enough. You have his eyes. She stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, child. You look dead on your feet. The boarding house was immaculately clean, smelling of lye soap and baking bread. Mrs. Abernathy led them to a small parlor and instructed Violet to sit while she fetched some tea. I have no money, Violet said quietly to Blake when the older woman had left. Everything was in the house. Blake removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair in need of a trim. Don't worry about that now. The town takes care of its own. I'm not one of your own, she pointed out. We live too far out to be considered part of Silver Creek. You are now, he said simply. Mrs. Abernathy returned with a tray holding a teapot, cups, and a plate of biscuits. She poured the tea with practiced efficiency. Drink this, then we'll get you cleaned up and into some proper clothes. I keep extras for emergencies. She cast a meaningful glance at Blake. The deputy can return tomorrow after you've had a chance to rest. Blake nodded, understanding the dismissal. He placed his hat back on his head and turned to Violet. I'll check in on you tomorrow, Mrs. Porter. We'll figure out what comes next. After he had gone, Mrs. Abernathy helped Violet to a small room on the second floor, where a copper tub was filled with hot water. The older woman provided clean clothes, soap, and a towel, then left her alone with instructions to soak as long as needed. Violet sank into the water, watching as the soot turned it gray almost immediately. As she scrubbed her skin, she felt as though she were washing away her old life, revealing someone new beneath someone she didn't yet recognize. The tears came again, silent but steady, mixing with the bathwater until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. When she finally emerged, clean but emotionally exhausted, she found a simple blue dress laid out on the bed. It fit well enough, though it was slightly loose around her waist, a testament to the months of poor appetite following her husband's death. Mrs. Abernathy knocked softly before entering with a bowl of stew and more bread. Eat, then sleep, she ordered kindly. Tomorrow is soon enough to face the world again. Violet ate mechanically, tasting nothing. When she finally laid down on the soft bed, sleep claimed her immediately, dragging her into blessed darkness where she didn't have to remember that she had lost everything twice over. Morning came with the sound of roosters crowing and wagons beginning to move along the main street. For a moment, Violet thought she was back at the homestead, and Thomas would be outside already, tending to the animals. Then reality crashed over her like ice water. She dressed in the borrowed clothes and made her way downstairs, where she found Mrs. Abernathy serving breakfast to her other boarders, two older men who appeared to be minors, and a young woman who introduced herself as the schoolteacher. Sit and eat, Mrs. Abernathy instructed, placing a plate of eggs and bacon before Violet. Deputy Holloway left word he'd be by at 9 to take you back out to your property. Violet nodded, forcing herself to eat despite having no appetite. She would need her strength for what lay ahead. Blake arrived precisely at 9, driving a wagon rather than riding his horse. His badge caught the morning sunlight as he tipped his hat to Mrs. Abernathy. Mrs. Porter, he greeted Violet. If you're ready, we can head out. The journey back to her homestead was silent. Violet watched the landscape roll by, the sweeping grasslands dotted with wildflowers, the distant mountains still capped with snow even in late spring. It was beautiful country, harsh but breathtaking. She and Thomas had fallen in love with it instantly. When they arrived at the burned-out shell of her home, the sight was no less devastating in the clear light of day. Blake helped her down from the wagon and stood quietly beside her as she surveyed the destruction. I know it looks hopeless, he said after a while, but if there's anything to be found, we'll find it. They worked methodically through the ruins, Blake lifting charred beams while Violet sifted through the ashes beneath. By midday, they had recovered precious little: a cast-iron skillet, blackened but still usable, a few metal tools, a small tin box containing Thomas's pocket watch, the glass cracked but the mechanism intact, and miraculously, their marriage certificate, protected by the metal document box it had been stored in. Violet clutched the watch and certificate to her chest, tears threatening again. "Thank you," she whispered. "These mean more than I can say." Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We should head back soon. It'll be getting hot, and you need to stay out of this sun." As they were loading the few salvaged items into the wagon, the sound of hooves approaching made them both turn. 3 riders approached, and Violet felt Blake tense beside her. "Mrs. Porter, please get in the wagon," he said quietly, his hand moving to rest on the pistol at his hip. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by his change in demeanor. "Just a precaution," he replied, his eyes never leaving the approaching men. "That's Vernon Cobb and his boys. They've been trying to buy up land all around these parts. Not always by honest means." Violet climbed into the wagon but watched as the 3 men reined in their horses a few yards away. The leader, a portly man with a flamboyant mustache and expensive clothes, removed his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Deputy Holloway," he greeted. "Terrible business, this fire. Just terrible." His eyes shifted to Violet, assessing. "Mrs. Porter, I presume?" "Vernon Cobb, at your service. I own the Silvertop Mining Company." Blake stepped forward, positioning himself between Cobb and the wagon. "What brings you all the way out here, Cobb?" "Neighborly concern, Deputy. Nothing more." Cobb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "In fact, I came to make Mrs. Porter an offer. This land, while now tragically damaged, still has value. I'd be willing to take it off her hands for a fair price." Violet felt a cold anger replace her grief. "This land is not for sale, Mr. Cobb." Cobb's smile faltered slightly. "Mrs. Porter, be reasonable. You're a widow with no home. What do you intend to do? Rebuild all by yourself?" "That's not your concern," Blake interjected, his voice hard. "Mrs. Porter has friends in Silver Creek who will help her decide what's best for her future." One of Cobb's companions, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "This land's gonna be worthless to you, madam. No crops this year means no income. Winter comes hard in these parts." "I'm well aware of the challenges," Violet replied, her chin lifting. "My answer remains the same." Cobb replaced his hat, his jovial facade slipping. "Well, if you change your mind, my offer stands. For now." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Porter." "Deputy." With that, the 3 men turned their horses and rode away. Blake watched them go, his posture rigid until they were out of sight. Then he climbed into the wagon beside Violet. "Vultures," he muttered, taking up the reins. "Do you think they had something to do with the fire?" Violet asked, the thought occurring to her for the first time. Blake's jaw tightened. "I can't prove anything, but it wouldn't surprise me. Cobb's been trying to get his hands on as much land as possible for his mining operations. He's not particular about how he acquires it." As they drove back towards Silver Creek, Violet gazed out at her land, 20 acres of good Montana soil that she and Thomas had worked so hard to tame. Could she really just sell it and walk away? The thought made her chest ache. "What am I going to do?" she asked, more to herself than to Blake. He was quiet for a long moment. "My ranch is about 5 miles east of town," he said finally. "It's not much, just a small house and barn on 50 acres. I've got a bunkhouse where my ranch hand stays, but he's moved on recently. It's empty." Violet turned to look at him, surprised. "Are you offering me a job, Deputy Holloway?" "Blake," he corrected. "And yes, I suppose I am. I could use help with the place, cooking, keeping house, maybe tending a garden. The bunkhouse would be yours, and I'd pay a fair wage." He looked slightly uncomfortable. "It would give you time to decide what to do about your land without Cobb breathing down your neck." Violet considered his offer. Living alone with an unmarried man, even in separate buildings, would raise eyebrows. But she had few options, and something about Blake Holloway inspired trust. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully. "But wouldn't it be improper?" A slight smile touched Blake's lips. "Mrs. Abernathy would likely agree to act as chaperone, coming out once a week to ensure all is as it should be. Would that ease your concerns?" Violet found herself returning his smile, the first since the fire. "It might. I'll consider it." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As Silver Creek came into view again, Violet realized she felt something she hadn't expected, a flicker of hope amidst the ashes of her old life. The next morning, Violet woke early, her mind made up. After a sleepless night weighing her limited options, Blake's offer seemed the most sensible path forward. It would provide shelter, income, and time to decide what to do about her land. At breakfast, she informed Mrs. Abernathy of her decision. "Humph," the older woman responded, pursing her lips. "Blake Holloway is a good man, one of the few truly honorable ones in these parts. Still, a young widow living on his property will set tongues wagging." "He mentioned you might be willing to visit regularly," Violet said. "To ensure propriety." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled unexpectedly. "Did he now? Well, I suppose I could take the wagon out once a week. For appearance's sake." Blake arrived mid-morning with the wagon loaded with supplies from the general store: flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. "I took the liberty of purchasing a few things you might need," he explained as he helped Violet up into the wagon. "Consider it in advance on your wages." The journey to Blake's ranch took them east of Silver Creek, through rolling grassland dotted with stands of pine and aspen. As they crested a gentle hill, Blake pointed ahead. "There it is. The Holloway place. Nothing fancy, but it's home." Violet saw a modest but well-maintained ranch house with a wide porch, a large barn, a corral containing several horses, and a smaller structure she assumed was the bunkhouse. A creek ran along the northern edge of the property, and a small vegetable garden was visible behind the main house. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Blake looked pleased. "Been working on it for 5 years now. Started with nothing but the land and built it up bit by bit." As they approached, Violet noticed a large, shaggy dog bounding toward them, barking enthusiastically. "That's Buck," Blake said. "Don't worry, he's friendly. Just noisy." They pulled up in front of the main house, and Blake helped Violet down from the wagon. Buck circled them, tail wagging furiously, until Blake commanded him to sit. "Let me show you the bunkhouse first," he offered, leading the way to the smaller building about 50 yards from the main house. The bunkhouse was simple but clean, with a small stove for heating, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a chest for clothing. A window looked out toward the creek, allowing fresh air and light to fill the space. "It's not much," Blake apologized, "but it's solid and dry." "It's perfect," Violet assured him, already imagining how she might make it more homelike with a few touches. They moved on to the main house, where Blake showed her the kitchen she would be working in. It was larger than the one she'd had at the homestead, with a good stove, a pump for water, and ample counter space. "I usually just make do with beans and bacon," Blake admitted. "It'll be nice to have real cooking again." After the tour, they sat on the porch with cups of coffee, discussing her duties and wages. Blake was fair, offering her Sundays off and pay that exceeded what she had expected. "What about your deputy work?" she asked. "Won't that take you away from the ranch?" Blake nodded. "I'm in town 3 days a week, sometimes more if there's trouble. The sheriff handles the rest. I've managed to keep the ranch going, but it would do better with someone here full-time." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Violet felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected to find so soon after her loss. This wasn't what she had planned for her life, but perhaps it could be a new beginning. "Thank you, Blake," she said softly, "for all of this." He looked at her, his blue eyes serious. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Mrs. Porter, even in a place as unforgiving as this." The following weeks fell into a rhythm as Violet settled into life at the Holloway Ranch. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Blake headed out to tend to the cattle and horses. When he was away in town fulfilling his deputy duties, she kept busy with housekeeping, cooking, and revitalizing the neglected vegetable garden. The bunkhouse became her sanctuary, a place that, while not her own home, at least offered privacy and solitude when she needed it. She had arranged her few salvaged possessions carefully. Thomas's pocket watch sat on the small table by her bed, and their marriage certificate was carefully stored in a drawer. At night, she would sometimes take out the watch and listen to its steady ticking, a reminder of a life now gone. Blake proved to be a considerate employer, never demanding or critical. He seemed genuinely appreciative of her cooking and the order she brought to his home. They often shared meals together, their conversations gradually becoming more comfortable as they learned about each other's lives. How did you come to be both a rancher and a deputy? Violet asked one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Blake leaned back in his chair, his hat resting on his knee. I came west after the war, served with the Union Army. Didn't have much to go back to in Pennsylvania, so I headed west like so many others. Worked as a cowhand for a few years, saved every penny. When this land came up for sale, I took a chance. And the deputy's badge? A smile touched his lips. Sheriff McAllister caught me breaking up a fight in the saloon one night. Said I had a good head on my shoulders and offered me a job. The pay helps supplement what the ranch brings in, especially in lean years. Violet nodded, understanding the need for multiple sources of income in the unpredictable frontier economy. What about you? Blake asked. How did you and your husband end up in Montana territory? Violet's gaze drifted to the distant mountains. Thomas had consumption. The doctor in Chicago said the mountain air might help his lungs. We sold everything we had and came west 3 years ago. She sighed softly. The air did seem to help, for a while at least. We were happy here, despite the hardships. Blake was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Losing someone you love is never easy. No, she agreed. It isn't. As promised, Mrs. Abernathy visited once a week, arriving in her wagon loaded with baked goods and town gossip. Despite her ostensible role as chaperone, she seemed more interested in matchmaking than chaperoning, often finding excuses to leave Blake and Violet alone together. That woman is about as subtle as a bull in a china shop, Blake remarked after one such visit, watching Mrs. Abernathy's wagon disappear down the road. Violet laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as the weeks passed. She means well. That she does, Blake agreed, his eyes lingering on Violet's face. Can't say I entirely disagree with her intentions, either. The comment hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging it directly, but both aware of the growing attraction that simmered beneath their employer-employee relationship. June turned to July, bringing intense heat that left the grasslands dry and golden. Violet worried about her abandoned property, wondering if anyone was keeping an eye on it in her absence. I should go check on the land, she mentioned to Blake one morning as she served him breakfast. Make sure Cobb hasn't tried anything. Blake looked up from his eggs, concern evident in his expression. I wouldn't recommend going alone. Cobb's men have been seen in that area frequently. Will you come with me? She asked. He nodded. Of course. We can ride out tomorrow. The next day, they set out early to avoid the worst of the heat. Blake rode his chestnut gelding, while Violet sat atop a gentle mare named Daisy that Blake kept for light work. As they approached Violet's property, she felt a knot form in her stomach. The blackened remains of her home were still visible, a stark reminder of all she had lost. But it was the sight of fresh wagon tracks and disturbed earth that made her gasp. Someone's been here, she said, dismounting quickly despite Blake's warning to be careful. Blake was beside her in an instant, his hand on his pistol as he surveyed the area. Stay close to me. They approached the ruins cautiously. Violet could see that someone had been digging through the ashes, much as she had done that first day. But why? What could they possibly hope to find? Blake, she called, pointing to a spot beyond the house where the earth had been disturbed in a different way, deliberately dug up in a pattern of holes about 3 feet apart. Blake's expression darkened. Test holes, he said grimly. For mining. Mining? On my land. Violet felt anger rising within her. They have no right. No, they don't, Blake agreed. But Cobb isn't known for respecting property rights. This confirms what I suspected. He believes there's something valuable under your land. They searched the rest of the property, finding more test holes and evidence that someone had been camping nearby. As they prepared to leave, the sound of approaching horses made them both tense. Vernon Cobb and 4 of his men rode into view, pulling up short when they spotted Blake and Violet. Well, Cobb called, his voice falsely jovial. Deputy Holloway and Mrs. Porter. What a pleasant surprise. Blake positioned himself slightly in front of Violet. Can't say the same, Cobb. Care to explain why you're trespassing and conducting mining tests on Mrs. Porter's property without permission? Cobb's smile never wavered. Just assessing the land's value, Deputy. For a fair offer, of course. An offer I've already declined, Violet said firmly. This is private property, Mr. Cobb. You and your men need to leave immediately. Cobb's smile faded. Mrs. Porter, I've been patient. But my patience has limits. This land has silver running beneath it, not a major vein, but enough to be worth my time. I'm prepared to offer you $500. That's more than generous. Not interested, Violet replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The scarred man from their previous encounter spat on the ground. Boss, we don't need to waste time negotiating. The woman's got no claim she can defend. Her husband's dead, house is gone. Who's to say she hasn't abandoned the property? Blake's hand moved to his pistol. I'm to say, Harrison, as an officer of the law, I'm witnessing Mrs. Porter's clear statement that this land is not abandoned and not for sale. Tension crackled in the air as the men stared each other down. Finally, Cobb raised a hand in a gesture of apparent surrender. No need for unpleasantness today. We'll be on our way. His eyes locked with Violet's. But consider my offer carefully, Mrs. Porter. The Montana Territory can be a dangerous place for a woman alone. After Cobb and his men rode away, Blake turned to Violet, his expression grave. This changes things. Cobb won't give up easily if he believes there's silver here. What can I do? Violet asked, feeling helpless against the power and resources Cobb commanded. Blake was quiet for a moment, thinking. For now, we continue as we have been. You stay at my ranch where it's safe. I'll speak with the sheriff about increasing patrols in this area and file a formal complaint about the trespassing. He looked at her seriously. But Violet, you need to consider your options carefully. Fighting a man like Cobb won't be easy. As they rode back to Blake's ranch, Violet's mind raced with possibilities. Sell the land and leave her past behind entirely? Fight for what was rightfully hers. And what of her growing feelings for Blake? Feelings that complicated her decisions even further. One thing was certain, the peace she had begun to find at the Holloway ranch now seemed fragile, threatened by forces beyond her control. August brought relentless heat and heightened tensions. Blake's complaint to the sheriff resulted in increased patrols around Violet's property, but Cobb's men were clever, avoiding the law while continuing their activities. Rumors spread through Silver Creek that Cobb was telling people Violet had abandoned her claim and he had purchased it legally. It's a lie. Violet fumed one evening as she and Blake sat on his porch after dinner. How can he get away with such blatant falsehoods? Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. In territories like this, the law can be flexible, especially when money's involved. Cobb's been bribing officials in Helena, according to Sheriff McAllister. So I just lose everything? My land, my home, what's left of it anyway? Violet stood abruptly, pacing the length of the porch. Thomas and I worked too hard for me to just surrender it to a man like Cobb. Blake watched her for a moment before speaking. There might be a way to strengthen your claim. How? He hesitated, then met her gaze directly. By proving you haven't abandoned it. Building something new there. A small cabin, at least. Violet stopped pacing. With what money? What help? I can't possibly. I would help you. Blake interrupted. And others in town would too. Mrs. Abernathy has been rallying support. People don't like Cobb and his tactics. Violet sat back down, touched by the offer, but still uncertain. That's incredibly generous, but I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask. I offered. Blake's voice was gentle but firm. Violet, in the months you've been here, I've come to. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've come to care about what happens to you. And what's right is right. That land is yours. The sincerity in his blue eyes made Violet's heart beat faster. The attraction between them had grown steadily, though neither had acted on it out of respect for propriety and Violet's still fresh grief. Thank you, she said softly. I'll think about it. The decision was made for them 3 days later when a rider from town brought urgent news Cobb's men had been seen heading toward Violet's property with lumber and supplies. He's going to build on your land, Blake said grimly as they mounted up immediately. Establish his own claim. They rode hard, Buck loping alongside them. When they arrived, their worst fears were confirmed. A team of men were already laying out the foundation for a structure, while others unloaded supplies from wagons. Blake didn't hesitate. He rode directly up to the site, Violet close behind. This is private property, he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. You are all trespassing and need to disperse immediately. The men looked up, some reaching for weapons until they recognized the deputy's badge. A foreman stepped forward. "We got papers saying this land's been purchased legal-like by Mr. Cobb," he claimed, producing a document from his pocket. Blake dismounted and took the paper, examining it closely. "This is a forgery," he declared. "The rightful owner is right here." He gestured to Violet. "Mrs. Porter has never sold this land." The foreman looked uncertain. "I just go where I'm told and build what I'm paid to build, Deputy. If there's a dispute, that's between you and Mr. Cobb." "There is no dispute," Violet said, finding her voice. "This is my land. Those are fraudulent papers." A commotion at the edge of the property drew their attention. Vernon Cobb rode up, flanked by his usual companions, including the scarred man called Harrison. "What seems to be the problem here?" Cobb asked, feigning innocence. Blake held up the forged document. "Fraud is the problem, Cobb. This deed wouldn't hold up in any legitimate court." Cobb shrugged, unperturbed. "The territorial courts are a long way off, Deputy. And possession is 9/10 of the law, as they say. Not when the possession is obtained through criminal means," Blake countered. "As an officer of the law, I'm ordering your men to vacate this property immediately." Harrison sneered. "One deputy against all of us. Those ain't favorable odds, Holloway." Violet felt fear coil in her stomach as she realized how outnumbered they were. But Blake stood his ground, his hand resting casually near his pistol. "Maybe not," he acknowledged. "But I won't be alone for long. Sheriff McAllister and a posse are on their way. Seems someone in town overheard your plans and sent word." Cobb's confident expression faltered slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Blake challenged. "Are you willing to risk finding out?" "Assaulting a law officer carries a heavy penalty, Cobb. Even your money might not buy your way out of that one." A tense silence fell over the group as Cobb weighed his options. Finally, he gave a curt nod to his men. "Pack it up," he ordered. "We'll settle this another day." As Cobb's men began to load their supplies back onto the wagons, Cobb himself rode closer to Blake and Violet. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "One way or another, I'll have this land." "No, you won't," Violet replied, surprising herself with her steadiness. "I'll build a new home here myself before I let you steal it." Something dangerous flashed in Cobb's eyes. "We'll see about that, Mrs. Porter. We'll see." After Cobb and his men had departed, Violet let out a shaky breath. Was the sheriff really on his way? Blake gave her a small smile. No, but Cobb didn't need to know that. They surveyed the abandoned construction materials scattered across what had once been Violet's garden. "They left quite a bit behind," Blake observed. "Too much to carry in one trip, I imagine." Violet looked at the lumber, nails, and tools thoughtfully. "Enough to start a small cabin, wouldn't you say?" Blake turned to her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Mrs. Porter, are you suggesting we appropriate Mr. Cobb's materials for your own building project?" "I believe I am, Deputy Holloway," she replied, returning his smile. "After all, they were left on my property." Blake laughed, a warm sound that eased the tension of the confrontation. "I'll ride to town tomorrow, gather some volunteers. We can start building this weekend." As they prepared to leave, Violet took one last look at her land still scarred by fire, but now holding the promise of rebuilding. For the first time since the flames had claimed her home, she felt truly hopeful about the future. True to his word, Blake returned from town the next day with news that several men had volunteered to help build a simple cabin on Violet's property that weekend. Mrs. Abernathy had organized the women of Silver Creek to provide food for the workers and gather household items Violet would need. "The whole town's talking about standing up to Cobb," Blake reported as they sat at his kitchen table that evening. "People are tired of his strong-arm tactics." "I never expected such support," Violet admitted, touched by the community's response. "I've always felt like an outsider here." Blake reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. "Not anymore, you're not." The touch sent warmth spreading through her, and Violet found herself increasingly aware of how much she had come to depend on Blake's steady presence in her life. He had become more than an employer, more than a friend, though exactly what he was to her now, she wasn't quite ready to define. Saturday dawned clear and promised to be hot, but that didn't deter the dozen men who showed up at Violet's property ready to work. The sheriff himself came, partly to help and partly to ensure Cobb didn't cause trouble. Women from town arrived with baskets of food and offers of assistance to Violet. Nothing brings a community together like a barn raising, or in this case, a cabin raising, Mrs. Abernathy observed as she helped Violet set up a food table under a makeshift awning. By midday, the cabin's frame was taking shape. It would be small, just 2 rooms, but it would be enough to establish Violet's continued claim to the land. The men worked efficiently, many having experience with such construction from building their own homes. Blake moved among them, sometimes directing, sometimes working alongside them, his shirt soon soaked with sweat in the August heat. Violet found her eyes drawn to him repeatedly throughout the day, admiring his strength and the easy way he led without dominating. As the sun began to set, the basic structure was complete: walls up, roof on, though the interior would need more work. The volunteers gathered for a final meal before heading back to town, tired but satisfied with their accomplishment. "It'll need finishing inside," the sheriff told Violet as he prepared to leave, "but it's enough to show clear intent to occupy. I'll file the proper papers on Monday to strengthen your claim." "Thank you, Sheriff," Violet said sincerely. "I can't express how grateful I am to everyone." After the others had gone, Blake remained, surveying their day's work in the fading light. "It's not much compared to what you lost," he said, "but it's a start." Violet stood beside him, looking at the small cabin. "It's more than I had yesterday." They were silent for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Finally, Blake turned to her. "Violet, I need to ask you something." Her heart quickened at his serious tone. "Yes. These past months, having you at the ranch. It's been—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words, which was unusual for him. "I've grown accustomed to your presence. More than accustomed. The thought of you moving back here, alone. Are you asking me not to move back to my land?" Violet asked, confused. Blake shook his head. "No. I'm asking if you might consider another arrangement." He took a deep breath. "Violet Porter, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The question hung in the air between them. Violet stared at him, momentarily speechless. "I know it's sudden," Blake continued quickly. "And I know you're still grieving Thomas. I don't expect you to love me the way you loved him. But I care for you deeply, and I believe we could build a good life together. You could keep your land, and we could work both properties. Or sell one, if that's what you preferred. He looked at her earnestly. "I just want you in my life, Violet." Tears welled in Violet's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. She had been so focused on survival, on not losing what little she had left, that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge how much Blake had come to mean to her. "Blake," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I care for you too. More than I thought possible after losing Thomas. But marriage is a practical solution as well as a personal one," he finished for her. "It would strengthen your claim to this land. Cobb would have an even harder time challenging the property rights of a married woman with a deputy for a husband." Violet smiled through her tears. "Is that why you're proposing?" "For practical reasons." Blake stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "No," he said softly. "I'm proposing because the thought of not seeing you every day makes my heart ache. Because you're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever known. Because somehow, in the midst of all this chaos, I've fallen in love with you, Violet Porter." The simple declaration undid her completely. Violet felt something inside her break open, not painfully, but like a dam giving way to waters that had been held back too long. She realized with sudden clarity that she loved him too, had perhaps begun falling in love with him that very first day when he'd found her digging through the ashes of her old life. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Blake Holloway." His face lit up with joy, and he pulled her gently into his arms. Their first kiss was tender, tentative, but filled with promise, the promise of a new beginning, of a love built not on the ashes of the past, but on the foundation of who they were together. As they rode back to Blake's ranch that evening, Violet felt lighter than she had in months. The future, which had seemed so bleak after the fire, now stretched before her full of possibilities. She would always carry Thomas in her heart, but she had room there for Blake, too, room for this unexpected second chance at happiness. News of their engagement spread quickly through Silver Creek, met with general approval and, in Mrs. Abernathy's case, smug satisfaction. "Knew at the moment I saw you two together," she declared when they announced their plans to marry in 2 weeks' time. "Some things are just meant to be." The wedding was set for the first Saturday in September to be held at the small church in Silver Creek. In the meantime, work continued on Violet's cabin, with Blake and various volunteers helping to finish the interior. Though she wouldn't be living there after the wedding, they agreed it was important to complete it both to secure her claim against Cobb and to provide a place they could use when working that land. Vernon Cobb had been suspiciously quiet since the confrontation, which made Blake uneasy. "He's planning something," he told Violet one evening a week before the wedding. Cobb doesn't give up easily. His concerns proved justified when, 3 days before the wedding, Violet's newly completed cabin was found burned to the ground. Sheriff McAllister rode out to Blake's ranch personally to deliver the news. "Found tracks leading back toward Cobb's mining camp," he reported grimly. "But nothing we can prove in court." Violet sat at Blake's kitchen table, hands clenched tightly together. "So he just gets away with it? Again?" "Not necessarily," the sheriff replied. "The whole town knows Cobb's behind this. Public opinion is turning against him. Several businesses are refusing to deal with his company now. That won't rebuild my cabin," Violet pointed out bitterly. Blake, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "No, but it gives us an opportunity." Both Violet and the sheriff looked at him questioningly. "Cobb's shown his hand," Blake explained. "He's desperate enough to commit arson again. That suggests the silver vein is more valuable than he initially let on." "So?" Violet asked. "So instead of rebuilding the cabin, we negotiate from a position of strength. Offer to sell him mineral rights only, while retaining ownership of the land itself." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Could work. Cobb gets what he wants, the silver, and Mrs. Porter keeps her property and gets compensation." "I don't want to give him anything," Violet said fiercely. "Not after what he's done." Blake took her hand. "I understand. But this way, you don't lose everything. The land stays in your name, and the money from the mineral rights could help us improve the ranch. We'd be using Cobb's own greed against him." Violet considered the idea, her initial anger gradually giving way to pragmatic consideration. "How would we ensure he doesn't just take everything once we've signed an agreement?" "The agreement would be filed with the territorial court," the sheriff explained. "And I'd make sure it was ironclad. Plus, with Blake as your husband, Cobb would think twice about trying any further tricks." After further discussion, Violet reluctantly agreed to the plan. The sheriff would arrange a meeting with Cobb for the following day. That night, as they sat on Blake's porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, Violet leaned against Blake's shoulder. "Are you sure about this strategy?" she asked. "It feels like surrendering." Blake put his arm around her. "It's not surrender. It's strategy. Sometimes you have to bend to avoid breaking." He kissed the top of her head. "Besides, our focus should be on our future together, not fighting a war with Cobb." Violet nodded, finding comfort in his steady presence. "3 more days," she murmured. "3 more days until you're Mrs. Holloway." Blake agreed, his voice warm with anticipation. "Though I hope you'll still be the same stubborn, determined woman I fell in love with." She laughed softly. "Count on it." The meeting with Cobb the next day went better than expected. Faced with the possibility of mineral rights without the complication of land ownership, and aware of his declining reputation in town, Cobb agreed to their terms, though not without considerable negotiation over the percentage of profits Violet would receive. 10% of any silver mined from the property, plus a $500 initial payment, Blake insisted. Non-negotiable. Cobb finally relented, signing the agreement the sheriff had prepared. "You drive a hard bargain, Deputy Holloway," he said as he handed over a bank draft for the initial payment. "Almost makes me regret not dealing with Mrs. Porter directly from the start." "Almost," Violet echoed dryly, not fooled by his attempt at charm. With the agreement signed and the bank draft in hand, a weight lifted from Violet's shoulders. The land would remain hers, and the money would allow them to make improvements to Blake's ranch that would benefit them both. "One battle won," Blake commented as they rode away from the sheriff's office where the meeting had taken place. "Now we can focus on the wedding." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, a perfect early September day. Mrs. Abernathy had taken charge of preparing Violet for the ceremony, bringing a beautiful cream-colored dress that had belonged to her daughter. "She's back east now, married to a banker," Mrs. Abernathy explained as she helped Violet dress. "Said I should find a good use for it, and I can't think of a better one." The dress fit as if it had been made for Violet, needing only minor adjustments to the length. Mrs. Abernathy arranged Violet's dark hair in an elegant style adorned with small wildflowers. "Blake won't know what hit him," the older woman declared, stepping back to admire her work. The small church was packed with townspeople, many of whom Violet had only met briefly, but who had come to support the couple who had stood up to Vernon Cobb. Blake waited at the altar, looking uncharacteristically nervous in his best suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. When Violet entered on Sheriff McAllister's arm, who had offered to give her away, a hush fell over the congregation. Blake's face transformed, his expression of nervous anticipation melting into one of undisguised love and admiration. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, each speaking clearly and with conviction. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Blake's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, drawing good-natured cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward was held at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house, where tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by the women of Silver Creek. There was music, dancing, and plenty of well wishes from the community that had adopted Violet as one of their own. "Happy, Mrs. Holloway?" Blake asked as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. Violet looked up at him, this man who had found her at her lowest moment and offered not just help, but a new life filled with love and possibility. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she answered honestly. "Thank you for finding me that day." Blake's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for being brave enough to take my hand." As the celebration continued around them, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the ashes of devastation had risen something beautiful and unexpected, a love that promised to be as enduring as the Montana landscape that had witnessed its beginning. Winter came early that year, blanketing the Holloway ranch in snow by late October. Violet and Blake had settled into married life with surprising ease, their complementary strengths creating a partnership that benefited them both. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts, and the money from Cobb's mineral rights allowed them to hire two hands to help with the expanding herd of cattle. Cobb himself had struck silver on Violet's land, though not in the quantities he had hoped. The monthly payments he sent were modest but consistent, providing a welcome supplement to their income from the ranch. On a cold December evening, as they sat before the fire in their home, Blake presented Violet with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "An early Christmas gift," he replied, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Open it." Inside, Violet found a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny photograph of their cabin, not the one that had burned, but a new, larger one they had built on her land during the fall. They used it occasionally when working that side of their combined property. "Blake, it's beautiful," she said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "But why give it to me now instead of Christmas?" He took her hand, his expression serious but warm. "Because I thought you might want to wear it tomorrow when we go to see Dr. Stevens." Violet's heart skipped a beat. "Why would we need to see the doctor?" A slow smile spread across Blake's face. "Because I've noticed you've been tired lately, and sick in the mornings. And I thought, maybe, we should confirm what I suspect." Tears filled Violet's eyes as she realized what he was suggesting. She had noticed the same symptoms, but had been afraid to hope, to believe that such happiness could be hers after all she had lost. "You think I'm—" She couldn't quite say the words. Blake nodded, squeezing her hand. "I think we might be welcoming a new Holloway come summer. Dr. Stevens confirmed their suspicions the next day. Violet was indeed expecting a child, due in late June. The news filled them both with joy and a renewed sense of purpose. Their family, like their love, had risen from the ashes of loss to create something new and precious. 5 years later, Violet stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Blake taught their 4-year-old son Benjamin to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter Emma sat on Violet's hip, clapping her small hands as her brother managed to stay mounted through a complete circle of the corral. "Mama, look," Benjamin called proudly. "I'm a cowboy like Papa." "I see you," Violet called back, her heart full to bursting with love for her family. Blake looked up at her, his face weathered now from years of working outdoors, but his blue eyes still as bright and loving as the day he'd first found her digging through the ashes of her old life. He tipped his hat to her in a gesture that had become a special signal between them, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had overcome together. Vernon Cobb had long since moved on, the silver vein having played out after just 2 years. The land that had once been a source of such conflict now served as a productive part of their expanded ranch operation. The cabin they had built there stood as a testament to resilience and new beginnings. As Violet watched her husband and son, with her daughter warm in her arms and another child growing beneath her heart, a secret she would share with Blake, that evening she reflected on the twisting path that had led her here. From devastation had come renewal. From loss had come love more profound than she could have imagined. Blake often said that the Montana Territory, for all its harshness, rewarded those who refused to surrender. Violet now understood that the same could be said of life itself. By refusing to give up in her darkest hour, she had found not just survival but joy, not just existence, but a life rich with purpose and love. The sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Blake lifted Benjamin from the pony and set him on his shoulders, making the boy giggle with delight as they walked toward the house toward home. "Ready to go in?" Blake asked as he reached the porch, extending his hand to her just as he had that first day among the ashes. Violet shifted Emma to her other hip and placed her free hand in his, feeling the familiar strength and tenderness in his grip. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm ready." And together, the family walked into the warm light of the home they had built not just of wood and nails, but of love, courage, and the unshakable belief that even from the darkest ashes, new life could rise.